Okay, so welcome back. This session is going to be part two in a series of presentations dealing with open source business software. In part one, we talked a little bit about approaches. We talked about the differences between best of breed and integrated business systems, and then we discussed open source software for business applications. In part two, we want to talk a little bit about deployment options for open source software and an implementation methodology. So, in terms of deploying open source software and pretty much any client server based business software, there's a server and a workstation component, and the workstation side is getting easier and easier. BYOD stands for Bring Your Own Device. So it's the newest and most advanced systems can support any type of access. In other words, you can be using a desktop, a browser, a mobile phone, tablet, etc., either through a browser or a native application. On the server side, it's a little bit different. We're also moving towards platform independence, but we can also have different alternatives in terms of how we're going to deploy those servers. So the actual installation itself can be a native installation or a virtual image. With open source software, that type of thing is available. It's a lot more difficult with proprietary software because the virtual image contains the operating system. So which is usually an open source operating system because of the difficulty of providing virtual images with proprietary operating systems due to licensing issues. And the server itself can be deployed either in-house, which is a traditional way of doing it, or in the cloud, which is the way most people are moving. And in the cloud, there's different ways of doing that, which we're going to talk about very shortly. And generally, the process goes from a staging server to a production server. So when we go live, staging server is for setting up the configuration and doing testing and training and that sort of thing. And when we're ready to go live, we want to move to a production server. So in some cases, again, with open source software, it's pretty flexible. We can do our staging on one server, which could be in-house, could be in the cloud, and then the production server could be somewhere else. It also could be in-house or in the cloud, depending on what is the best solution. So in terms of cloud deployment, if that's what's chosen, there's really different ways or different layers. That's one way to think of it. In terms of infrastructure as a service, we're really looking at a virtual server, which is, for all intents and purposes, the same thing as a physical server, except we have some advantages if the server is virtual. So we can do things like dynamically expand it if we're running out of capacity, or we'll only pay for what we use. That type of thing. It's pretty easy to get up and running on a new virtual server by just provisioning it. And some of the vendors are, most prominent ones are Amazon, Rackspace, but there's a lot of other ones as well. Software as a service is a bit of a different model. That type of way of delivering business applications can be either open source or proprietary. So some of the open source vendors that we talked about offer their system as a hosted service or a pay-for-fee type of service. But there's also proprietary vendors who do that as well. So the difference is, in the case of the open source vendors, you can always, for example, start off in the cloud, use the applications and database, and then decide to move it in-house if you like. Because of the fact that the applications are open source, you can duplicate the entire environment in-house or locally either as a backup or as you grow, you might want to decide to change where you're going to be hosting your system. In the case of proprietary offerings, you can't do that because they control everything, and the applications are proprietary. So you license it to use it in the cloud, but your license doesn't give you the ability to get a copy of those applications and install them in-house. So that's just something to be aware of. Platform as a service is the third layer, but it really applies to development platforms, which aren't really relevant for this particular discussion. So if we get into implementation methodology, we want to talk about the process from beginning to end. The first step is really a needs analysis or diagnostic, and we talk about something called critical success factors, which means things that the company has to get right in order to succeed. So these are the kinds of things that we want to make sure are available in any alternative that we're going to look at, or any solution that we're going to deploy. It's also a good idea to prioritize the needs. So it's important to know which needs are most important. So when we look at alternatives, we can determine which ones are what we call showstoppers. In other words, if the solutions don't have certain things, then we're going to move on to something else. So when looking at the alternatives and looking at total cost of ownership, we want to make sure to consider solutions that are proven and meet our critical success factor needs. We don't want to start with a solution that we're the first one or a guinea pig. We want to make sure this system has been implemented, and preferably in similar types of companies. As we talked about in the previous session, integrated solutions are usually more efficient but harder to implement, so that's something to keep in mind. Again, it depends on the situation of the company. We want to consider support alternatives. It's very important to have timely support, or something called service level agreements. We want to make sure that if we run into a problem, it's going to get solved relatively quickly. We don't have to rely on a support forum, for example, where we post a message and wait for people to answer it when they have time. So that's generally something that companies are willing to pay for. Don't forget, in our calculation of total cost of ownership, and this might be in some cases intangible and hard to put a number on, but it's the cost of exit. In other words, how much dependency are we going to be placing on this solution if they're going to be taking care of everything for us, like including backups and hosting the system and updating the applications, etc., etc. How difficult is it going to be to get our data out, and if we want to move it to something else, or get the applications if we want to host it ourselves in-house, that type of thing. And then we want to weigh advantages and disadvantages for each alternative, and keep in mind that every alternative that we look at is going to have strengths and weaknesses. The important thing is to try to find something that's a good fit. So we want to consider how we're going to be deploying the system, whether it's in-house or in the cloud, or again, we can start off in-house and move to the cloud, or vice versa. We want to do a proof of concept, which is really important. What I recommend is downloading the community version, installing it, and testing it extensively with company data and configured for our needs. So sometimes that can be somewhat time consuming, and it's always good to get a consultant who knows the system very well to help you with this, but I think it's well worthwhile. Otherwise, you're making a really big investment in a system based on what a vendor is telling you it's going to be able to do, and sometimes you don't find out until well into the project that it's not really going to do the things that you thought it was going to do, which is unfortunately too late. We also want to make sure that we have user training. That's really important and shouldn't be skipped over. If the users aren't well trained on the system, they're not going to use it properly and they're not going to get good use of it. Some things are not always intuitive, although the user interface should be. It still helps an awful lot if you have some good user training, and of course documentation is also important. Sometimes that's something that some of the projects skip over because nobody likes to do documentation, but it's really an important component to be able to understand a system. We want to make sure we have a good project plan which talks about who's going to do what and by when, and have a schedule. It's important, for example, to time implementation, let's say during a slower period of the business, and have targets that we're gonna shoot for. It's also important to have some project management, either internal or external, somebody to make sure that the project is staying on track and doesn't go out of scope and go in different directions. And it's really important in terms of making the implementation successful. We want to make sure to document any customizations or modifications, especially extensive customization or customization of source code. This becomes really important when we come to do upgrades in the future. So that's something should be definitely that should be done. And then, if possible, we want to implement it in phases. So depending on the situation, if there's multiple companies, for example, we want to start off with one company, look at do a review of the implementation and see what lessons we learned from that, and see how we can make it better when we go to implement the next company. Or if it's a multi-divisional situation within the same company, we can start off by implementing one company first, and then one division first, and then other divisions, that type of thing. Outside consulting services, so it's really about adding value or services. So these are the kinds of things that you can outsource or get from another company that's gone through the process before, knows the system. But it's important when evaluating outside services that you're going to look at companies that are somewhat objective, especially if you're going to help them to evaluate and select the software. I use the expression, if all you sell is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So you don't want to go to a company that is committed to one particular solution and ask them to compare it to other solutions. They're not going to be able to look at it objectively. So some of the services that are often good to contract and get help with are things like analyzing your requirements, evaluating and helping you to select the system, preparing a project plan, training, project management, customization, integration, data migration, technical support, and hosting. Now, of course, if you have the expertise in-house, you can do these things yourself, but most companies haven't gone through an implementation before, and if they have, it isn't necessarily the same product. So it's really a good idea to get outside help for these types of things. So the next part of the series, we're going to start doing some demos of some of the products that we talked about in the first session, both best of breed open source software and integrated open source ERP and accounting software. If you have any comments, I'd really appreciate it if you can leave them in the comments section down below. I'm planning to upload this to YouTube, and there should be a comment section below the YouTube video. Anyways, my name is Fred Blauer from Fred Blauer & Associates. I hope you enjoyed this, found it useful. You can all our contact information is at openaccounting.ca. Thanks for listening. Bye.